Talk. Close of apprenticeship. 1839 to 1841. What are great gifts but the correlative of great work? We are not born for ourselves, but for our kind, for our neighbors, for our country. It is but selfishness, indolence, a perverse fastidiousness, and unmanliness, and no virtue or praise, to bury our talent in a napkin. Cardinal Newman. Along with his domestic and parliamentary concerns, we are to recognize the ferment that was proceeding in Mr. Gladstone's mind upon new veins of theology, but it was an interior working of feeling and reflection, and went forward without much visible relation to the outer acts and facts of his life during this period. As to those, one entry in the diary, February 1, 1839, tells a sufficient tale for the next 2 years. I find I have, besides family and parliamentary concerns and those of study, 10 committees on hand: Millbank, Society for Propagation of the Gospel, Church Building Metropolis, Church Commercial School, National Schools Inquiry and Correspondence, Upper Canada, Clergy, Additional Curates Fund, Carlton Library, Oxford and Cambridge Club. These things distract and dissipate my mind. Well, they might, for in any man with less than Mr. Gladstone's amazing faculty of rapid and powerful concentration, such dispersion must have been disastrous both to effectiveness and to mental progress. As it is, I find little in the way of central facts to remark in either mental history or public action. He strayed away occasionally from the fathers and their pastures and dipped into the new literature of the hour, associated with names of dawning popularity. Carlyle he found hard to lay down. Some of Emerson, too, he became acquainted with, as we have already seen, but his mind was far too closely filled with transcendentalisms of his own to offer much hospitality to the serene and beautiful transcendentalism of Emerson. He read Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, and on the latter he makes a characteristic comment: the tone is very human, it is most happy in touches of natural pathos. No church in the book, and the motives are not those of religion. So with Hallam's History of Literature, finished, October 10, 1839, his theological chapter, in which I am sorry to find amidst such merits, what is even far more grievous than his anti-church sarcasms, such notions on original sin as in 4. Page 161. He found Chillingworth's Religion of Protestants a work of the most mixed merits, an ambiguous phrase which I take to mean not that its merits were various, but that they were much mixed with those demerits for which the Puritan Chanel baited the unlucky latitudinarian to death. About this time also he first began Father Paul's famous History of the Council of Trent, a work that always stood as high in his esteem as in Macaulay's, who liked Sarpi the best of all modern historians. To the great veteran poet of the time Mr. Gladstone's fidelity was unchanging, even down to compositions that the ordinary Wordsworthian gives up. Read aloud Wordsworth's Cumberland Beggar and Peter Bell. The former is generally acknowledged to be a noble poem. The same justice is not done to the latter. I was more than ever struck with the vivid power of the descriptions, the strong touches of feeling, the skill and order with which the plot upon Peter's conscience is arranged, and the depth of interest which is made to attach to the humblest of quadrupeds. It must have cost great labor, and is an extraordinary poem, both as a whole and in detail. Let not the scorner forget that Matthew Arnold, that admirable critic and fine poet, confesses to reading Peter Bell with pleasure and edification. In the political field he moved steadily on. Sir Peel spoke to him, April 19, 1839, in the House about the debate and wished him to speak after Shiel, if Graham, who was to speak about 8 or 9, could bring him up. Peel showed him several points with regard to the committee which he thought might be urged. This is very kind in him as a mark of confidence, and assures me that if, as I suspect, he considers my book as likely to bring me into some embarrassment individually, yet he is willing to let me still act under him, and fight my own battles in that matter as best with God's help I may, which is thoroughly fair. It imposes, however, a great responsibility. I was not presumptuous enough to dream of following Shiel, not that his speech is formidable, but the impression it leaves on the House is. I meant to provoke him. A mean man may fire at a tiger, but it requires a strong and bold one to stand his charge, and the longer I live, the more I feel my own, intrinsically, utter powerlessness in the House of Commons. But my principle is this: not to shrink from any such responsibility when laid upon me by a competent person. Scheil, however, did not speak, so I am reserved and may fulfill my own idea, please God, tonight. The Jamaica Case. We come now to one of the memorable episodes in this vexed decade of our political history. The sullen demon of slavery died hard. The Negro still wore about his neck galling links of the broken chain. The transitory stage of apprenticeship was in some respects even harsher than the bondage from which it was to bring deliverance, and the old iniquity only worked in new ways. The pity and energy of the humane at home drove a perplexed and sluggish government to pass an act for dealing with the abominations of the prisons to which the unhappy blacks were committed in Jamaica. The Assembly of that island, a planter oligarchy, resented the new law from the mother country as an invasion of their constitutional rights, and stubbornly refused in their exasperation, even after a local dissolution, to perform duties that were indispensable for working the machinery of administration. The Cabinet in consequence asked Parliament, April 9, to suspend the Constitution of Jamaica for a term of 5 years. The Tory opposition, led by Peel with all his force, aided by the aversion of a section of the Liberals to a measure in which they detected a flavour of dictatorship, ran the ministers, May 6, within 5 votes of defeat on a cardinal stage. I was amused, says Mr. Gladstone, with observing yesterday the differences of countenance and manner in the ministers whom I met on my ride. Ellis, their friend, would not look at me at all. Charles Wood looked but askance and with the hat over the brow. Grey shouted, "Wish you joy." Lord Howick gave a remarkably civil and smiling nod, and Morpeth a hand salute with all his might, as we crossed in riding. On Monday night after the division, Peel said just as it was known and about to be announced, Jamaica was a good horse to start. Of his own share in the performance, Mr. Gladstone only says that he spoke a dry speech to a somewhat reluctant House. I cannot work up my matter at all in such a plight. However, considering what it was, they behaved very well. A loud cheer on the announcement of the numbers from our people, in which I did not join. To have won the race by so narrow a majority as 5 seemed to the Whigs, wearied of their own impotence and just discredit, a good plea for getting out of office. Peel proceeded to begin the formation of a government, but the operation broke down upon an affair of the bedchamber. He supposed the Queen to object to the removal of any of the ladies of her household, and the Queen supposed him to insist on the removal of them all. The situation was unedifying and nonsensical, but the Queen was not yet 20, and Lord Melbourne had for once failed to teach a prudent lesson. A few days saw Melbourne back in office, and in office he remained for 2 years longer, 137. Catherine Gladstone. Click to return to list of illustrations. 2. Marriage. In June 1839 the understanding arrived at with Miss Catherine Glynn during the previous winter in Sicily, ripened into a definite engagement, and on the 25th of the following July their marriage took place amid much rejoicing and festivity at Harden. At the same time and place, Mary Glynn, the younger sister, was married to Lord Lyttelton. Sir Stephen Glynn, their brother, was the 9th, and as was to happen, the last baronet. Their mother, born Mary Neville, was the daughter of the 2nd Lord Braybrooke and Mary Grenville his wife, sister of the 1st Marquis of Buckingham. Hence Lady Glynn was one of a historic clan, granddaughter of George Grenville, the Minister of American Taxation, and niece of William, Lord Grenville, head of the Cabinet of all the Talents in 1806. She was first cousin therefore of the younger Pitt, and the Glynns could boast of a family connection with 3 prime ministers, or if we choose to add Lord Chatham who married Hester Grenville, with 4, 138, I told her, Mr. Gladstone recorded on this occasion of their engagement, June 8, what was my original destination and desire in life, in what sense and manner I remained in connection with politics. I have given her, led by her questions, these passages for canons of our living. Le Fronde, onde es en fronda tutto el orto. Del ortolano eterno, mio cotanto. Quanto de lui allor di bene e porto. 139. And Dante again. In la sua volontate nostra pace. Ella e qual mare, al qual tutto si move. 140. In few human unions have the good hopes and fond wishes of a bridal day been better fulfilled or brought deeper and more lasting content. 60 long years after, Mr. Gladstone said, it would not be possible to unfold in words the value of the gifts which the bounty of Providence has conferred upon me through her. And the blessing remained radiant and unclouded to the distant end. At the close of August, after posting across Scotland from Greenock by a route better known now than then to every tourist, the young couple made their way to Foskay, where the new bride found an auspicious approach and the kindest of welcomes. Her entrance into her adoptive family was much more formidable than it would be to those who had been less loved, or less influential, or less needed and lent upon, in the home where she was so long a queen. At Foskay all went as usual. Soon after his arrival, his father communicated that he meant actually to transfer to his sons his Demerara properties, Robertson to have the management. This increased wealth, so much beyond my needs, with its attendant responsibility is very burdensome, however on his part the act be beautiful. 3. The parliamentary session of 1840 was unimportant and dreary. The government was tottering. The Conservative leaders were in no hurry to pluck the pear before it was ripe, and the only men with any animating principle of active public policy in them were Cobden and the League Against the Corn Law. The attention of the House of Commons was mainly centred in the case of Stockdale and the publication of debates. But Mr. Gladstone's most earnest thoughts were still far away from what he found to be the dry sawdust of the daily politics, as the following lines may show. March 16, 1849. Manning dined with us. He kindly undertook to revise my manuscript on church principles. March 18. Yesterday I had a long conversation with James Hope. He came to tell me, with great generosity, that he would always respond to any call, according to the best of his power, which I might make on him for the behalf of the common cause. He had given up all views of advancement in his profession. He had about £400 a year, and this, which includes his fellowship, was quite sufficient for his wants. His time would be devoted to church objects. In the intermediate region he considered himself as having the first tonsure. Hope urged strongly the principle, let every man abide in the calling. I thought even over strongly. My belief is that he forgoes the ministry from deeming himself unworthy. The object of my letter to Hope was in part to record on paper my abhorrence of party in the church, whether Oxford party or any other. March 18. Today a meeting at Peel's on the China question, considered in the view of censure upon the conduct of the administration, and a motion will accordingly be made objecting to the attempts to force the Chinese to modify their old relations with us, and to the leaving the superintendent without military force. It was decided not to move simultaneously in the Lords, particularly because the Radicals would, if there were a double motion, act not on the merits but for the ministry. Otherwise, it seemed to be thought we should carry a motion. The Duke of Wellington said, God, if it is carried, they will go, that they were as near as possible to resignation on the last defeat, and would not stand it again. Peel said, he understood 4 ministers were then strongly for resigning. The Duke also said, our footing in China could not be re-established, unless under some considerable naval and military demonstration, now that matters had gone so far. He appeared pale and shaken, but spoke loud and a good deal, much to the point and with considerable gesticulation. The mind's life I never saw more vigorous. The China question. The Chinese question was of the simplest. British subjects insisted on smuggling opium into China in the teeth of Chinese law. The British agent on the spot began war against China for protecting herself against these malpractices. There was no pretense that China was in the wrong, for in fact the British government had sent out orders that the opium smugglers should not be shielded, but the orders arrived too late, and war having begun, Great Britain felt bound to see it through, with the result that China was compelled to open 4 ports, to cede Hong Kong, and to pay an indemnity of £600,000. So true is it that statesmen have no concern with Pater Nosters, the Sermon on the Mount, or the Vade Mecum of the moralist. We shall soon see that this transaction began to make Mr. Gladstone uneasy, as was indeed to be expected in anybody who held that a state should have a conscience. 141, on April 8, 1840, his journal says, read on China. House. Spoke heavily, strongly against the trade and the war, having previously asked whether my speaking out on them would do harm, and having been authorized. An unguarded expression brought him into a debating scrape, but his speech abounded in the pure milk of what was to be the Gladstonian word. I do not know how it can be urged as a crime against the Chinese that they refused provisions to those who refused obedience to their laws whilst residing within their territory. I am not competent to judge how long this war may last, nor how protracted may be its operations, but this I can say, that a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with disgrace, I do not know and I have not read of. Mr. Macaulay spoke last night in eloquent terms of the British flag waving in glory at Canton, and of the animating effect produced upon the minds of our sailors by the knowledge that in no country under heaven was it permitted to be insulted. But how comes it to pass that the sight of that flag always raises the spirits of Englishmen? It is because it has always been associated with the cause of justice, with opposition to oppression, with respect for national rights, with honorable commercial enterprise, but now under the auspices of the noble Lord Palmerston, that flag is hoisted to protect an infamous contraband traffic, and if it were never to be hoisted except as it is now hoisted on the coast of China, we should recoil from its sight with horror, and should never again feel our hearts thrill, as they now thrill, with emotion when it floats magnificently and in pride upon the breeze. Although the Chinese were undoubtedly guilty of much absurd phraseology, of no little ostentatious pride, and of some excess, justice in my opinion is with them, and whilst they the pagans and semi-civilized barbarians have it, we the enlightened and civilized Christians are pursuing objects at variance both with justice and with religion. 142, May 14. Consulted, various persons, on opium. All but Sir Inglis were on grounds of prudence against its, a motion against the compensation demanded from China, being brought forward. To this majority of friendly and competent persons I have given way, I hope not wrongfully, but I am in dread of the judgment of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China. It has been to me matter of most painful and anxious consideration. I yielded specifically to this. The majority of the persons most trustworthy feel that to make the motion would, our leaders being in such a position and disposition with respect to it, injure the cause. June 1. Meeting of the Society for Suppression of the Slave Trade. This was the occasion of a speech from Prince Albert, who presided. Exeter Hall crammed is really a grand spectacle. Samuel Wilberforce, a beautiful speaker, in some points resembles Macaulay. Peel excellent. June 12. This evening I voted for the Irish Education Grant, on the ground that in its principle, according to Lord Stanley's letter, it is identical practically with the English grant of 33-8, and I might have added with the Kildare Place grant. To exclude doctrine from exposition is in my judgment as truly a mutilation of Scripture, as to omit bodily portions of the sacred volume. Social diversion. His first child and eldest son was born, June 3, and Manning and Hope became his godfathers. These two were Mr. Gladstone's most intimate friends at this period. Social diversions were never wanting. One June afternoon he went down to Greenwich, Grillion's fish dinner to the Speaker. Great merriment, and an excellent speech from Stanley, good sense and good nonsense. A modest one from Morpeth. But though we dined at 6, these expeditions do not suit me. I am ashamed of paying £2.10 for a dinner. But on this occasion the object was to do honor to a dignified and impartial speaker. He had been not at all grateful, by the way, for the high honor of admission to Grillion's dining club this year, a thing quite alien to my temperament, which requires more soothing and domestic appliances after the feverish and consuming excitements of party life, but the rules of society oblige me to submit. As it happened, so narrow is man's foreknowledge, Grillians down to the very end of his life, nearly 60 years ahead, had no more faithful or congenial member. July 1st. Last evening at Lambeth Palace I had a good deal of conversation with Colonel Gurwood about the Duke of Wellington and about Canada. He told me an anecdote of Lord Seaton which throws light upon his peculiar reserve, and shows it to be a modesty of character, combined no doubt with military habits and notions. When Captain Colborne, and senior officer of his rank in the 21st Foot, he, Lord Seaton, was military secretary to General Fox during the war. A majority in his regiment fell vacant. General Fox desired him to ascertain who was the senior captain on the command. Captain so-and-so of the 80th, I think. Write to Colonel Gordon and recommend him to His Royal Highness for the vacant majority. He did it. The answer came to this effect: the recommendation will not be refused, but we are surprised to see that it comes in the handwriting of Captain Colborne, the very man who, according to the rules of the service, ought to have this majority. General Fox had forgotten it, and Captain Colborne had not reminded him. The error was corrected. He, Gurwood, said he had never known the Duke of Wellington speak on the subject of religion but once, when he quoted the story of Oliver Cromwell on his deathbed, and said, "That state of grace, in my opinion, is a state or habit of doing right, of persevering in duty, and to fall from it is to cease from acting right." He always attends the service at 8 a.m. in the Chapel Royal, and says it is a duty which ought to be done, and the earlier in the day it is discharged the better. July 24th. Heard James Hope in the House of Lords against the Chapters Bill, and he spoke with such eloquence, learning, lofty sentiment, clear and piercing diction, continuity of argument, just order, sagacious tact, and comprehensive method, as one would say would have required the longest experience as well as the greatest natural gifts. Yet he never acted before, save as counsel for the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway. If hearts are to be moved, it must be by this speech. 143, July 27th. Again went over and got up the subject of opium compensation as it respects the Chinese. I spoke thereon 1.5 hours for the liberation of my conscience, and to afford the friends of peace opposite an opportunity, of which they would not avail themselves. In August he tells Mrs. Gladstone how he has been to dine with such an odd party at the Guizot's: Austin, Radical lawyer; John Mill, Radical reviewer; M. Gaskell, Monkton Milnes; Thirlwall, new Bishop of St. David's; George Lewis, Poor Law Commissioner. Not very ill-mixed, however. The host is extremely nice. An odd party indeed. It comprised 4 at least of the strongest heads in England, and 2 of the most illustrious names of all the century in Europe. Examiner at Eton. In March 1840, Mr. Gladstone and Lord Lyttelton went to Eton together to fulfill the ambitious functions of examiner for the Newcastle Scholarship. In thanking Mr. Gladstone for his services, Hawtrey speaks of the advantage of public men of his stamp undertaking such duties in the good cause of the established system of education, as against the nonsense of utilitarians and radicals. The questions ran in the familiar mold in divinity, niceties of ancient grammar, obscurities of classical construction, caprices of vocabulary, and all the other points of the old learning. The general merit Mr. Gladstone found beyond anything possible or conceivable when he was a boy at Eton a dozen years before. We sit with the boys, 39 in number, and make about 10 hours a day in looking over papers with great minuteness. Although it is in quantity hard work, it is lightened by a warm interest, and the refreshment of early love upon a return to this sweet place. It is work apart from human passion, and is felt as a moral relaxation, though it is not one in any other sense. This is a curious experience to me, of jaded body and mind refreshed. I propose for Latin theme a little sentence of Burke's which runs to this effect: flattery corrupts both the receiver and the giver, and adulation is not of more service to the people than to kings. April 2nd. The statistics become excessively interesting. Henry Hallam gained, and now stands second, the brother of his dead friend. April 3rd. In 6 hours, out, from 4 to 5 hours more upon the papers. Vinegar, thank God, carries my eyes through so much MS, and the occupation is deeply interesting, especially on Hallam's account. Our labors were at one time anxious and critical, the two leaders being 1388 and 1390 respectively. At night, however, all was decided. April 4, 12.2. Viva voce for 14 select. At 2.5 Seymour was announced scholar to the boys, and chaired forthwith. Hallam, medalist. It was quite overpowering. Henry Hallam was the second son of the historian, the junior of Arthur by some 14 or 15 years. Mr. Gladstone more than a generation later described a touching supplement to his Eton story. In 1850 Henry Hallam had attained an age exceeding only by some 4 years the limit of his brother's life. During that autumn I was traveling post between Turin and Genoa, upon my road to Naples. A family coach met us on the road, and the glance of a moment at the inside showed me the familiar face of Mr. Hallam. I immediately stopped my carriage, descended, and ran after his. On overtaking it, I found the dark clouds accumulated on his brow, and learned with indescribable pain that he was on his way home from Florence, where he had just lost his second and only remaining son, from an attack corresponding in its suddenness and its devastating rapidity with that which had struck down his eldest-born son 17 years before. At Foscari, where his autumn sojourn began in September, he threw himself with special ardor into his design for a college for Scotch Episcopalians, especially for the training of clergy. He wrote to Manning, August 31, 1840. Hope and I have been talking and writing upon a scheme for raising money to found in Scotland a college akin in structure to the Romish seminaries in England, that is to say, partly for training the clergy, partly for affording an education to the children of the gentry and others who now go chiefly to Presbyterian schools or are tended at home by Presbyterian tutors. I think £25,000 would do it, and that it might be got. I must have my father's sanction before committing myself to it. Hope's intended absence for the winter is a great blow. Were he to be at home, I do not doubt that great progress might be made. In the kirk toil and trouble, double, the fires burn and cauldrons bubble, and though I am not sanguine as to very speedy or extensive resumption by the Church of her spiritual rights, she may have a great part to play. At present she is very weakly manned, and this is the way I think to strengthen the crew. Glenalmond. The scheme expanded as time went on. His father threw himself into it with characteristic energy and generosity, contributing many £1,000s, for the sum required greatly exceeded the modest figure above mentioned. Mr. Gladstone conducted a laborious and sometimes vexatious correspondence in the midst of more important public cares. Plans were mature, and adequate funds were forthcoming, and in the autumn of 1842 Hope and the two Gladstones made what they found an agreeable tour, examining the various localities for a site, and finally deciding on a spot on a mountain stream, 10 miles from Perth, at the very gate of the Highlands. It was 1846 before the college at Glenalmond was opened for its destined purposes, 144. We all know examples of men holding opinions with trenchancy, decision, and even a kind of fervor, and yet with no strong desire to spread them. Mr. Gladstone was at all times of very different temper, consumed with missionary energy and the fire of ardent propagandism. Letter from Cobden. He labored hard at the 4th edition of his book, sometimes getting 11 hours of work, a good day as times go. Montesquieu, Burke, Bacon, Clarendon, and others of the masters of civil and historic wisdom being laid under ample contribution. By Christmas he was at Hawarden. In January he made a speech at a meeting held in Liverpool for the foundation of a church union, and a few days later he hurried off to Walsall to help his brother John, then the Tory candidate, and a curious incident happened. I either provided myself, or I was furnished from headquarters, with a packet of pamphlets in favor of the Corn Laws. These I read, and I extracted from them the chief material of my speeches. I dare say it was sad stuff, furbished up at a moment's notice. We carried the election. Cobden sent me a challenge to attend a public discussion of the subject. Whether this was quite fair, I am not certain, for I was young, made no pretension to be an expert, and had never opened my lips in Parliament on the subject. But it afforded me an excellent opportunity to decline with modesty and with courtesy as well as reason. I am sorry to say that, to the best of my recollection, I did far otherwise, and the pith of my answer was made to be that I regarded the Anti-Corn Law League as no better than a big boroughmongering association. Such was my first capital offense in the matter of protection, redeemed from public condemnation only by obscurity. The letters are preserved, but a sentence or two from Mr. Gladstone's to Cobden are enough. The phrases which you quote from a report in the Times have reference, not to the Corn Law, but to the Anti-Corn Law League and its operations in Walsall. Complaining apparently of these, you desire me to meet you in discussion, not upon the League but upon the Corn Law. I cannot conceive two subjects more distinct. I admit the question of the repeal of the Corn Laws to be a subject fairly open to discussion, although I have a strong opinion against it. But as to the Anti-Corn Law League, I do not admit that any equitable doubt can be entertained as to the character of its present proceedings, and, excepting a casual familiarity of phrase, I adhere rigidly to the substance of the sentiments which I have expressed. I know not who may be answerable for these measures, nor was your name known to me, or in my recollection at the time when I spoke. Time soon changed all this, and showed who was teacher and who the learner. By and by the session of 1841 opened, the Whigs moving steadily towards their fall, and Mr. Gladstone almost overwhelmed with floods of domestic business. He settled in the pleasant region which is to the metropolis what Delphi was to the habitable earth, and where, if we include in it Downing Street, he passed all the most important years of his life in London, 145, though he speaks of being overwhelmed by domestic business, and he was undoubtedly hard beset by all the demands of early housekeeping, yet he very speedily recovered his balance. He resisted now and always as jealously as he could those promiscuous claims on time and attention by which men of less strenuous purpose suffered the effectiveness of their lives to be mutilated. I well know, he writes to his young wife who was expecting him to join her at Hagley, you would not have me come on any conditions with which one's sense of duty could not be quieted, and would, I hope, send me back by the next train. These delays are to you a practical exemplification of the difficulty of reconciling domestic and political engagements. The case is one that scarcely admits of compromise. The least that is required in order to the fulfillment of one's duty is constant bodily presence in London until the fag end of the session is fairly reached. Here are a few examples of the passing days. March 12, 1841. Tracts for the Times, number 90, ominous. March 13. Went to see Reform Club. Sat to Bradley 2½ -4. London Library Committee. Carlton Library Committee. Corrected 2 proof sheets. Conversed an hour and a half with Mr. Richmond, who came to tea, chiefly on my plan for a picture life of Christ. Chess with C, his wife. March 14, Sunday. Communion, St. James's, St. Margaret's afternoon. Wrote on F's VU1 and read it aloud to servants. March 20. City to see Freshfield. Afternoon service in St. Paul's. What an image, what a crowd of images! Amidst the unceasing din, and the tumult of men hurrying this way and that for gold, or pleasure, or some self-desire, the vast fabric thrusts itself up to heaven and firmly plants itself on soil begrudged to an occupant that yields no lucre. But the city cannot thrust forth its cathedral, and from thence arises the harmonious measured voice of intercession from day to day. The church praying and deprecating continually for the living mass that are dead while they live, from out of the very center of that mass, silent and lonesome is her shrine, amidst the noise, the thunder of multitudes. Silent, lonesome, motionless, yet full of life, for were we not more dead than the stones, which built into that sublime structure witness continually to what is great and everlasting, did priest or chorister, or the casual worshipper but apprehend the grandeur of his function in that spot, the very heart must burst with the tide of emotions gathering within it. Oh, for speed, speed to the wings of that day when this glorious unfulfilled outline of a church shall be charged as a hive with the operations of the Spirit of God and of his war against the world, when the intervals of space and time within its walls, now untenanted by any functions of that holy work, shall be thickly occupied, And when the glorious sights and sounds which shall arrest the passenger in his haste that he may sanctify his purposes by worship, shall be symbols still failing to express the fullness of the power of God developed among his people. March 21. Wrote on 1 Thess. v. 17, and read it to servants. Read the Young Communicants, Bishop Hall's life. It seems as if at this time the number and close succession of occupations without any great present reward of love or joy, and chiefly belonging to an earthly and narrow range, were my special trial and discipline. Other I seem hardly to have any of daily pressure. Health in myself and those nearest me, comparative, wealth and success, no strokes from God, no opportunity of pardoning others, for none offend me. April 3. 2 or 3 nights ago Mrs. Wilbraham told Catherine that Stanley was extremely surprised to find, after his speech on the Tamworth and Rugby Railway Bill, that Peel had been very much annoyed with the expression he had used, that his right hand friend had in pleading for the bill made use of all that art and ingenuity with which he so well knew how to dress up a statement for that House, and that he showed his annoyance very much by his manner to him, afterwards. He, upon reflecting that this was the probable cause, wrote a note to Peel to set matters to rights, in which he succeeded, but he thought Peel very thin-skinned. William Cooper told me the other day at Mills's that Lord John Russell is remarkable among his colleagues for his anxiety during the recess for the renewal of the session of Parliament, that he always argues for fixing an early day of meeting, and finds pleas for it, and finds the time long until it recommences. A visit to Newnham, April 12. And thence to Oxford brought him into the centre of the Tractarians. He saw much of Hamilton, went to afternoon service at Littlemore, breakfasted in company with Newman at Merton, had a long conversation with Pusey on Track 90, and gathered that Newman thought differently of the Council of Trent from what he had thought a year or two back, and that he differed from Pusey in thinking the English Reformation un-Catholic. Mr. Gladstone replied that number 90 had the appearance to his mind of being written by a man, if in, not of, the Church of England, and would be interpreted as exhibiting the Tridentan system for the ideal, the Anglican for a mutilated and just tolerable actual. Then in the same month he finished Palmer on the Articles, deep, earnest, and generally trustworthy. Worked upon a notion of private Eucharistical devotions, to be chiefly compiled, and attended a meeting about colonial bishoprics, where he spoke but indifferently. 4. New Fiscal Policy. In 1841 the Whigs in the expiring hours of their reign launched Parliament and parties upon what was to be the grand marking controversy of the era. To remedy the disorder into which expenditure, mainly due to high-handed foreign policy, had brought the national finance, they proposed to reconstruct the fiscal system by reducing the duties on foreign sugar and timber, and substituting for Wellington's Corn Law a fixed 8-shilling duty on imported wheat. The wiser heads, like Lord Spencer, were aware that as an electioneering expedient the new policy would bring them little luck, but their position in any case was desperate. The handling of their proposals was curiously maladroit, and even if it had been otherwise, ministerial repute alike for competency and for sincerity was so damaged both, in the House of Commons and the country, that their doom was certain. The reduction of the duty on slave-grown sugar from foreign countries was as obnoxious to the abolitionist as it was disadvantageous to the West Indian proprietors, and both of these powerful sections were joined by the corn grower, well aware that his turn would come next. Many meetings took place at Sir Robert Peel's upon the sugar resolutions, and Mr. Gladstone worked up the papers and figures so as to be ready to speak if necessary. At one of these meetings, by the way, he thought it worthwhile to write down that Peel had the tradesman's household books upon his desk, a circumstance that he mentioned also to the present writer, when by chance we found ourselves together in the same room 50 years later. On May 10, his speech on the sugar duties came off in due course. In this speech he took the sound point that the new arrangement must act as an encouragement to the slave trade, that monster which, while war, pestilence, and famine were slaying their thousands, slew from year to year with unceasing operation its tens of thousands. As he went on, he fell upon Macaulay for being member of a cabinet that was thus deserting a cause in which Macaulay's father had been the unseen ally of Wilberforce, and the pillar of his strength, a man of profound benevolence, of acute understanding, of indefatigable industry, and of that self-denying temper which is content to work in secret, and to seek for its reward beyond the grave. Macaulay was the last man to suffer rebuke in silence, and he made a sharp reply on the following day, followed by a magnanimous peacemaking behind the Speaker's chair. Defeat of Whig ministry. Meanwhile, the air was thick and loud with rumors. Lord Eliot told Mr. Gladstone in the middle of the debate that there had been a stormy cabinet that morning, and that ministers had at last made up their minds to follow Lord Spencer's advice, to resign and not to dissolve. When the division on the sugar duties was taken, ministers were beaten, May 19, by a majority of 36, after fine performances from Sir Robert, and a good one from Palmerston on the other side. The cabinet, with a tenacity incredible in our own day, were still for holding on until their whole scheme, with the popular element of cheap bread in it, was fully before the country. Peel immediately countered them by a vote of want of confidence, and this was carried, June 4, by a majority of 1.